Hi friends, welcome back. I have an epic video for you. I've never tried to do more than one card in a video, and today we're going to go through two complete cards with two separate techniques, and then we'll take a quick look at a third card that combines the two. This is our first card. It's a mini slimline card, and it's featuring the Radiant Ornament die from Birchpress Designs. I have been in love with this ornament for years. It's amazing. It comes as a set of three. You don't buy them separately. They come together, and they each cut out a layer that stacks on top of each other. And it's truly stunning. I thought this LDRS creative, I think it's the large Christmas words, went really well with it. But then I wanted a background that was sort of subtle. So I made this one myself on my computer. I wanted to print it on shiny cardstock. So my laser printer seemed like the best option. You can download that for free on my website if you would like to do the same thing. So I'm starting with a piece of 6" by 7" cardstock and scoring it in half at 3.5 inches to create my card base. And then I'm taking that background printed panel and I am just trimming off the edge. Anytime you print something that should go edge to edge, there's a little bit of bleed, some like a margin around the edges that doesn't print. So there are stamps that do similar things that are really amazing. I don't have a lot of luck trying to stamp on shiny cardstock. So this seemed a little easier for me, and I wanted something that was super easy to mass produce for Christmas. I'm using my Beacon 3-in-1 glue here because this is a thinner cardstock. It's 65 pound. It's a Nina metallic. I've had it for at least 5 years, but I looked online and it looks like Simon Says Stamp sometimes carries it, but there are a bunch of other places I found it too. So I don't want to add a ton of moisture. I find the Beacon 3-in-1 is good for that because it is a solvent-based glue as opposed to like a water-based glue that can warp your paper. I cut out 'Tis the Season from that LDRS Creative set 3 times, and I cut out each of the layers of the Radiant Ornament die in a different color of teal cardstock. I could use spray glue, but I don't have great luck with it. It sticks well, but I end up with one of two things. Either I sprayed it and I ended up with adhesive on a side where I didn't want adhesive, and even if it dries not sticky, then it has slightly changed the color, or I managed to get it only on the one side, but it ends up all over my fingers by the time I'm done adhering all of the layers together, and I can't come up with a good way to get that sticky off. Sometimes I've been using the Elmer's version. So I'm doing this instead. I just took my Barely Art glue and scribbling on a silicone craft mat. This might be one from Stampin' Up, but really any silicone craft mat. If you have one for the kitchen, if you have like a waffle flower media mat, that would work too. And I'm not putting a ton of glue down, right? It comes out super thin from that precision tip. And then I can lay my die in there. And I'm going to pick it up here with my pokey tool so I don't get glue all over my fingers. I want the top of my layered die cuts to be nice and neat. But this gets a good layer of glue all over, and it's pretty easy cleanup. This particular die, the 'Tis the Season, is a little bit fiddly. There's a lot of tiny little lines, and it sort of moves and bends. So I'm just starting at one end. I've sped it up, but I went pretty slowly until I got to and then it went super quickly. So I've adhered all of those together. My challenge is that this Radiant Ornament die doesn't have a layer that is solid. So I'm going to cut that out myself. This is like a brushed silver cardstock. Again, I've had that forever, but any like metallic or glitter cardstock would look super beautiful here. I had already cleaned the glue off my silicone mat. There's a couple ways to do that. You could use a baby wipe, and if the glue is still wet, it'll wipe right off, or you can let it dry. And if there's enough glue on there, it will peel right off. So I just used the precision tip of my Barely Art glue, and I'm going to adhere that to my silver cardstock, and I'm going to hold that for a little bit. Anytime I'm trying to adhere to a shiny surface, I just want to give it a minute. So when that is dry, I'm going to take my scissors and I'm going to cut around it. It's not as bad as fussy cutting, right? Because I've got a pretty heavy ridge. All three of the colored cardstock layers are 100 pound. And so my scissors just glide right along. I'm really not in any danger of cutting my ornament. The trickiest bit is right around the top of the bulb. So I go slowly, but it works out okay. And then I will just trim that tiny little bit off the tip of the ornament. So this is substantial, right? You put 3 layers of 100 pound, and then that silver is super flimsy. Maybe it's 65, but probably less than that. I really only use it for things like this. You could glue that down to the front of your card and call it good. That would work just fine and be a really, really beautiful card. But I wanted to take this up another notch. To do that, I'm going to turn this into a magnetic keepsake ornament. And that means I need 4 layers that are a solid backer. So I've used a little removable adhesive, and I am just tacking it down to my darkest teal cardstock. And I'm going to trim all the way around it. And I'm going to do that 4 times, right? And then I will peel that off the back. I don't want to full on glue it down. I have to sandwich my magnet in there still. And then I'm just rubbing on that removable adhesive so I can tack that down. I'm going to take 2 of these and I'm going to hold them together while I punch out holes for the magnets. This way I can ensure that it's going to line up perfectly when I set it down on my card. In theory, you could use just 1 magnet. They're definitely strong enough. I get mine from Total Element, and it's a strong magnet. I looked them up the other day. I think it says it'll hold 0.6 pounds. But if you only have 1, it might spin on the card. It doesn't go quite back where I want it to go. So I'm using 2, but that's entirely up to you. So I'm going to take one of my layers that has the 2 holes in it, and I'm going to glue it to a solid layer, which is a mistake. We'll fix it later. And then I am gluing that down to the top of my card. What I should have done was just glue the layer with the holes to the front of the card. So I end up having to cut a 5th solid colored ornament, but it's totally unnecessary. Anyway, it worked out just fine. It always works out just fine, right? So I got that glued down, and once it's positioned, I have a real good sense of where I want my 'Tis the Season. Again, I kind of wish I hadn't cleaned up all that glue off my silicone mat. I really didn't want to spread it all out again and clean it up. So I am just using the precision tip, and I'm doing teeny tiny little dots. I don't want it oozing out. It does slightly miscolor my cardstock sometimes, and I was a little worried it might take the toner off of this piece of paper. So next we're working on building the magnetic components of our ornament. I've got my 2 circles. I feel like they're a little hard to see, so I colored them in with a pencil. You don't need to do that. And I'm adding a little bit of Nouveau Deluxe adhesive. I find it sticks better to non-porous surfaces, but as long as you really sandwich the 2 layers of cardstock together with some glue, they're not going anywhere. And then here is that extra ornament layer that I had to cut, and I'm going to adhere that onto the top. So the 2 magnets are almost completely invisible. These are just slightly, very slightly thicker than a layer of 100-pound cardstock. If I'm using like my Accent Opaque 120, you can't tell at all. So I set another solid ornament layer on top of the piece I have completely adhered to the card base. And then I am gluing my other piece with holes on top. I check every step of the way to make sure that I have the holes in the right spot. If I had accidentally flipped that layer with the holes, I didn't measure them. They aren't quite symmetrical. It might have ended up wonky. So double check your magnets and your magnet placement before you glue everything down. And then I'm going to glue my layers of my ornament, my radiant layers, on top of all of that. And those magnets are firmly sandwiched in there. I'm just double checking for any loose like little pieces. But this card is super quick and easy, right? I think I spent more time poking the little pieces out of the die cuts than anything else. So I'm definitely planning on making a bunch of these for Christmas. This next card is using the same Radiant Ornament die, and it is using a technique I learned from Jennifer McGuire. It's a window edge design, and I will link her video below. She does a whole bunch of cards using this design, and they're really, really amazing. So I have the same 'Tis the Season, cut 3 times. I've already glued and layered them. I have a card base. That white folded card base starts the exact same way, right? So it's 3.5 by 6 inches. And then that blue piece is 6 by 6, but we're going to cut that down later. So we'll come back to that. Right down the middle where my score line is, I am lining up my die, okay? And I love that I can see through this one really easily, and it's super obvious where the center is. I don't want it all the way at the top. I'm just creating a little window out of the middle, and I'm going to make sure it's centered right in the middle, and we're going to cut half of it using some partial die cutting. So I'm setting this down on my Spellbinders Platinum 6 platform, and on my top plate, I've used a Sharpie to kind of mark where the bevel begins. It will cut beyond the beginning of that bevel, but not quite all the way to the edge of the plate. So somewhere in between the two is the sweet spot. You don't have to get this perfect. It's going to work just fine because we're going to put a couple other layers on this card, both behind and then on top of it. I'm being really careful as I take my partial die cut piece out because I don't want to lose all those tiny little pieces. It's going to be easier if they just stay in place right where they were. And you can see how the front flap of my card can close now, and I still have that ornament fully visible. So this is that same printed background that I was using before, and I'm going to cut a 3.5 inch strip just like before. But this time, instead of chopping it down to 6 inches from top to bottom, I'm going to do some, it's not really partial die cutting, but I'm going to cut just part of the die out of it. I'm not worried about making sure it's exactly the same as the placement on the original card. I'm pulling it down far enough, and I'm going to line it up right down the center of the die and run it through my die cut machine. So now the opening on my panel matches the opening on my card. And I am just going to line it up right with the hole where the ornament is, glue it down, right? I'm adding the glue to the card base, and then I'll flip it over and use my scissors to trim off any of that extra paper. So I'm not measuring, I'm not having to try to align things just perfectly. This was stressing me out when I was trying to figure out how I was going to do it, and it was far easier than my anxiety had made it out to be. Do you do that? Do you worry about like how complicated something's going to be in your card making, and then you try it and you're like, oh, well, never mind then. I'll be doing that all the time now. I would love to know, like, what have you stressed out about that ended up being way easier than you thought it would be? I would love if you would tell me in the comments, because I stress out about these things more than I probably should. Anyway, back to our card. This is our 6 by 6 inch piece of teal cardstock, and I'm using, I think it's the Altenew woven stripes. I'll link it below. And I am just stamping along one edge with some white pigment ink. And then I'm going to heat set that to make sure that it doesn't smear. You could just wait for it to dry, like leave it overnight, and it would be fine, but I'm impatient. So I'm lining up my card with the ornament on the far left edge. I want that teal cardstock to go behind the ornament so we have a solid piece there, and we are going to have little pieces falling out of our card. And then I'm just making a tick mark at the top and the bottom so I know how much I can trim off the edge, and then I'll just save that for another project later on. After that, I can glue down my card base. Okay, so I'm using my Bearly Art glue because I want to have that precision tip option as I'm very delicately moving over to the ornament part and trying to make sure I get it behind all those loose little pieces that could fall out. I lost one, and that's not a big deal. I was afraid that if I lost more than that, I was going to run into issues of things being kind of wonky. I'm pressing this down firmly and making sure everything is adhered very carefully. And then we're going to trim this down a little bit. I want, I don't know, maybe a ½ inch, a little over ½ an inch hanging out from the side of the card. Again, this is 100% what Jennifer McGuire taught all of us like avid followers to do in her video. But I'm using a craft knife here. You certainly, if you have a trimmer that has one of those like sliding blades so you can get right up against it, that would work fine too. I don't have an issue using a craft knife, and I found it was a little easier to get right up against the edge there. If you want to try the craft knife, I think my biggest tip is don't try to cut all the way through your cardstock in one pass. Like, press firmly, but don't, try to, I don't know, cut the house apart. Just go more than once and your blade is going to slide right along that track. I'm using my scissors then just to trim around the rest of that, and it means that all the way behind that ornament, we still have that teal cardstock. Now I'm going to add just a little bit of silver glitter cardstock. I thought about adding it just at the top so it looked like the string that it was hanging from, but I liked it better this way. I showed a few early in the video and they were just too thick because it comes to that point down at the bottom. I needed something that was sort of appropriately proportioned. And then I'll just flip that over and cut the excess off of it. I didn't need it to go back behind the ornament. In fact, I really didn't want it to. It might have left sort of a lumpy ridge. This is not my best silver cardstock. This is stuff I'm trying to use up. So it's pretty thick and chunky. It doesn't matter for what I'm using it for here, but it certainly would if you tried to layer over the top of it. Next, we're going to begin adhering the layers of our ornament together. And for this card, we're just going to glue them to the front of the cardstock once we get the 3 pink layers and the silver layer stacked up together. I tried to make this one with the removable ornament, but it was too thick. It takes another layer of cardstock over the back panel to sandwich that magnet in there. And then it takes these 3 layers of pink plus the layer of silver plus 2 more layers on the back to sandwich the magnet. So the ornament is 6 layers plus one on the back. It didn't open very well. I've figured out a workaround, not for this particular ornament. It's too much, but it's totally worth it anyway. I figured out a workaround if you use a different kind of a die, and it's totally worth checking out. Spellbinders also has an ornament die that's new this year. It's the Nordic Ornament. I'll link it. And it comes with a solid piece for the back, so you wouldn't have to cut that out by hand. And it's really stunning. It's a really, really great ornament, and it would work beautifully for this. It doesn't have quite as many layers, and so you absolutely could make it as a removable ornament and use this exact same design. Um, I might I might be ordering that one too. It's on my wish list. Um, there's a lot of things on my wish list right now. So here I'm adhering the 'Tis the Season, and this time I did remember to do all of the layering at the same time right before I started gluing things onto my cardstock. And in this instance, I'm just going to throw that over to the side and I let it dry on there. The challenge was that there was so little glue left, it wasn't peeling off really nicely. So I've just left it for the next time I need to do this, and I'll put new glue on top of whatever's left over. I don't think it's going to mess anything up. I really only use that mat for glue. So I'm trimming around this and getting into the nooks and crannies at the top of the bulb. It's worth noting there is like a topper that goes on the bulb that you could certainly cut out of silver or some other solid colored cardstock, but it would have made it a lot trickier to do this card design because I would have had to die cut with two separate dies, which I actually end up doing in the next card. This kept it simple. This was easy enough that I could make multiples of these and send them out for Christmas pretty easily. As always, I'm constantly testing to make sure things are going to open. It doesn't perfectly show the entire ornament because there's so many layers. I kept it very slightly to the left, but it works out well. And that finishes up card number 2. If I'm honest, I'm super bummed I couldn't make the magnetic element work on the last card. So I was playing around. This is the Altenew snow globe builder to see if I could come up with a way to make it work in a similar design. And this turned out, you guys, this is my favorite of all the cards. Look how thin that snow globe is. There's only 2 layers of cardstock for the back. And I hid the magnets behind the tree and the snowman. You can see there's almost a tiny little bump behind each of them. But because the bulk is in the middle of the ornament, you don't have the issue where the card is catching on all those layers when you try to open it up. I've got one more layer of cardstock on the base of the card just to keep everything looking nice when you open it up. But I was super pleased with this one. I hope you like it too. Let me know in the comments if you'd like to see a full tutorial for this card, and I can certainly try. That concludes our video and our 3 card projects for today. I hope you liked them. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up, like, subscribe. You can find me on Instagram at Sassy's LLC, and I will see you for the next one.